On the 25th of May in Minneapolis in the United States, a man called George Floyd was killed, some would say murdered, by a policeman who knelt on his neck for nearly 9 minutes. He was asphyxiated. And as we know, that has set off an enormous and long-lasting protest in the US and elsewhere under the general banner of Black Lives Matter. We've seen protests in the UK, various places on the continent, and so on. Here at home, on the 10th of April, a man called Collins Khoza died after being assaulted by SANDF soldiers who accused him of having broken one of the regulations of the lockdown. In fact, all he had been doing was to drink a beer in his own yard. Since then, the SANDF has tried to deny responsibility, and the response from the government generally has been, to say the least, disappointing. Even before that, on the very first day of our lockdown, the 27th of March, Petrus Michels here in Cape Town died after having been assaulted by police because they accused him of going out to buy liquor in contravention of the lockdown regulations. And according to the Daily Maverick, by the 1st of June, 11 people had died in South Africa at the hands of security forces enforcing the lockdown regulations. All 11 were Black men. There's obviously a crisis, and earlier this week, late last week in fact, the Nelson Mandela Foundation put out a statement trying to deal with this. Before we get to that statement, a little bit of background about the foundation itself. So if you'll tell us a little bit about the purpose and the work of the NMF.
Thank you very much, Mike, for this opportunity. The Nelson Mandela Foundation was established by Madiba in 1999, and back then, he established the foundation to help deal with infrastructure deficiencies that were there. You'd go to rural areas and identify that they needed a clinic, a school, whatever else that the community needed. You'd then help build that through the foundation. Then in 2007, we then changed after Madiba then signaled that he needed to retire. So now we're doing three things. We're looking at Mandela Day, which is in fact the t-shirt I'm wearing. It's a day of activism. It's now recognized by the UN, the 18th of July, Madiba's birthday, as a day for doing activism, community activism, where the one looks after another. Whatever need there is, you then go try and fulfill it. So the second part of our work is what we call memory work, which is predominantly housed in the Nelson Mandela Foundation's building, the Center of Memory, where Madiba used to work. It has Madiba's office. We have Madiba's original writings from prison. We have recordings that he made both before he went to prison, while he was in prison, and post. And that we make available online to make sure that people can access this history easily. And it's that work that then tends to inform what we do around the work that we do on Madiba's understanding of history, what he ideally wanted to see happen in South Africa and the world. And we share that through quotes. Every day you can go to our Twitter handle, for example, to see what Madiba was doing. For example, today marks the 56th anniversary of Madiba's sentencing to life in prison, together with his comrades who were in the Rivonia trial. Now, this moment is big for many reasons, and I'll get to that in a moment. The third part of our work is what we call dialogue work. And this is where we convene dialogues on difficult issues, social difficult issues that the country and the world is facing. At the moment, we have a program which we've launched with the University of Columbia in the US, which is called Atlantic Fellows for Racial Equity. In fact, this week we'll be unveiling the first, the new cohort of these fellows who are 10 in from South Africa, 10 in the US, 20 every year. Now, today, the significance of today, which I thought I should maybe say a few words about. Like I indicated that it's the 56th anniversary of Madiba's release, sentence to life in prison, together with his comrades. And isn't it interesting? And it's such an irony that the same Madiba who was released in 1990 was fighting racism, was fighting a racial government, apartheid government. Today, we are still struggling with that.
Yeah.
Today, we are sitting here with me chatting to you because of racism.
Mm-hmm.
He was fighting inequality that was race-based. Today, it's still the same. Yes, there have been some changes, and he ideally wanted some things to happen, but he only served one term. We should never forget that.
No.
Today, we are dealing with gender-based violence, something that Madiba had to reckon with about his own chauvinism while he was a young man. And it took him, he says, to go to prison to realize that he was a male chauvinist. And it's important that today, as we celebrate this, the 56th anniversary of Madiba's sentencing to prison, and by the way, tomorrow then he was then landing on Robben Island for the first time to serve that life sentence. We then ask ourselves, we reckoned with the past that he was dealing with back then? Have we been able to come to terms with the people we were and the people we want to be in future? And our statement clearly that you started talking about earlier on, Mike, clearly says that we haven't. For as long as particularly black men can walk the street and be harassed by police, be killed by soldiers, here in South Africa, I'm not talking about the US, then we are in trouble. To get statistics from IPED, which says that in the last few years, over 200 people have died at the hands of police, who signal that over 3,000 people have been assaulted by police. And it tells you that we still have a long way to go in order to deal with white supremacy as it relates to unlearning the ways that apartheid taught us were right.
Mm-hmm.
When I was 14, I got assaulted by a policeman, 14 years old. I was scrawny. I'm a little big now, even though many consider me to be really still scrawny by any imagination. So here is a big man who then just comes in because there was a strike at our school, and he then takes the barrel of a gun, the end of this rifle rather, hits me on the forehead, knocks me out for a few seconds. A friend of mine was there, they tried to resuscitate me. I get up. When I get up, he doesn't care that whether I'm well or not. He just kicks me on my backside and says, keep running. Now, that's what the policemen learned was the right way to deal with black children, black men, black people generally. Now we have to unlearn those kind of things, and we can't deny that it's based on our colonial history, neo-colonial history being apartheid. And that's what we are then referring to as the Nelson Mandela Foundation.
You said in the statement that violent protest is often the result of careful calculation by communities who've come to see that only such action elicits the desired response from the state. Now, to me, that's a perfectly understandable and rational strategy. But what I find a bit less understandable and maybe a bit less rational is that here in South Africa, at least, many of those same communities don't seem to be using the available democratic mechanisms in the same calculated and sort of careful way by voting out of office the politicians that have failed to give them the response that they want. Is my attitude simplistic? Is it simplistic to expect people to use their vote as a weapon for change?
I think that's too simplistic. To build a society, it takes more than just one going to vote. And our systems of holding politicians accountable, for example, leave a lot to be desired.
Mm-hmm.
And until such time that our systems let people be able to hold politicians to account, and when you are unhappy about the politician, that they be removed. Until such time that, for example, a head of state, such as President Jacob Zuma, who had to be voted in, not by us, but by his party, changes, we will then not have a system that is seen to be fully democratic, in the sense that you can then vote the person you want into a position, instead of it being the power of the political party. What the Constitutional Court decided on just yesterday, that candidates can stand, independent candidates can stand on their own, tells you that we still have a long way to go in terms of making sure the fabric of our democratic system works as best as it should. Ideally, if you go to a community in a far-flung place, you should have a representative who cares enough to know that a resident doesn't have water, not to find out because of COVID that there's that need. And it's that we need to then ensure that the system works in full circle to address the needs of the people in terms of the democratic system that we have. Sometimes democracy can also fail us. And in that failure, it's that when communities then feel, but this person has been in power for so long, yet they don't give me the confidence that they care enough about my needs. And it's then that people then resort to unconventional ways of having to solve the problem that they have. And I think if we are to reimagine a society we want, it's one where delegates who go in to represent me are voted directly by me. That you can unseat a person if you feel that they have not fulfilled their promises to you. Thirdly, that we uproot the corruption that's in the system in order to then ensure that the system works for the poor and the marginalized. Fourth, that we ensure that those who remain voiceless beyond the vote, basically, are given the voice through representatives that are in parliament. And I think until such time that constituency system where people are expected to go back to their constituencies to go look after their needs, the imbizos that the presidency tends to host and the premiers tend to host, they need to then be made to realize fruit through ensuring that those people who have now lodged complaints about their councillors, they are then taken seriously.
So you are heading in the direction of some sort of electoral reform as a potential part of the solution to these problems.
I think it's there's no doubt with the decision of the court yesterday of the Constitutional Court that we have to have some kind of electoral reform, and how that looks like is still to be determined by us as South Africans. And I think it breaks my heart, to be honest with you, Mike, when I go to communities and I see what's happening. We're now blaming COVID to say COVID has brought about these cases. Yes, of course, in some instances, you do have cases where people used to be employed, now they're unemployed. So there's direct link to COVID. But how do you explain that a 70-plus-year-old can live in a home that has a gaping hole where a child can walk through? How do you explain that a 60-plus-year-old, a man who was used to work in the mines of course shut down and unemployed, got a lot of people unemployed. And today he lives in squalor conditions. And he'd been living like that, by the way, pre-COVID. How do you explain that communities still today have to just be content with drinking with animals? When we went to Limpopo, and I'm happy to report that having seen the conditions of some communities in Limpopo, we then raised some money for us to be able to build boreholes, which we are now going to deliver next week, in the coming week. Because while we were driving through these communities, you actually could see here are people drawing water, and not so far from them, there are cows that are drinking. And I think that's what we then have to contend with, to reckon with as a people, to say, how have we come here? Did we neglect our people for so long that these things now come to our attention because we are forced to revisit those communities?
Just coming back to the statement that you issued in particular, and referring back, as you do in that statement, to a quote from Madiba himself during the trial in 1964, where he was quite upfront, and he told the court that he had in fact planned sabotage, and the sabotage, even though it was against installations, was still an act of violence. And he said he planned it as a result of calm and sober assessment of the political situation that had arisen after many years of tyranny, exploitation, and oppression of my people by the whites. And then you go on to say in the statement that the use of violence can be rational and carefully targeted as part of a strategy to counter structural and other forms of violence against Black lives. Now, the obvious question that arises there is one of context. Madiba felt that he had no choice, and he probably didn't, in a white-controlled, oppressive, non-democratic state. But is violence ever justifiable in principle, in your opinion, in an open and constitutional and democratic state like we have?
If you were to look at the case in point that we were referring to of George Floyd, 400 plus years of a democratic state that has continued to just murder, imprison, just incarcerate in ways that cannot be even explained. There is a democratic state where you have one of the oldest democracies in the world. And that kind of democracy has not necessarily delivered the results, where people feel confident that they are able to express themselves in a way that delivers the results. Mm. Come to South Africa, fees must fall. You have young people who go out to the streets because they feel that they have been promised, or their parents had been promised free education, one that was never delivered. Back then, I'm on record having said that we should be careful of the fires that we're burning. But I also said that we also, just in the same vein, need to reckon with the fact that we are failing our people, that they have raised these issues in a democratic system and have not been heard through these channels. You are now forcing people to do things that they wouldn't necessarily always do. And I think we need to contend with that kind of reality. We have to contend with that kind of reality that sometimes people feel that democracy is failing me. I have tried everything possible to ensure that people listen, the state listens to me, but it's not. And what people then resort to is then ensure that they can then resort to the only thing that they have been taught is possible. And what Madiba was talking about in 64 is, after having, again, dealt with the state in many ways, trying to negotiate, do this, and nothing was coming up to give any results. And that's why then people resorted to that. I'm not justifying violence at all. To the contrary, I'm saying that do not force people into a corner where they are not able to then find any other means to express themselves. I'm saying, let us not be too hard at hearing. Let us ensure that the system works for the poor and the marginalized, the ones that feel that the state continues to be oppressive in a way that does not listen to what they're saying. And I'm not here to glorify violence at all. And I'll be the last person, having come on record back then under fees, with fees must fall, to then be the one who says, actually, you can go out and burn property and do all these things. I'm the last person to do such.
Coming back to something which you touched on a little bit earlier, this phenomenon that we're dealing with in our country at the moment, security force violence as part of the lockdown, but it also occurred long before we had lockdowns. It often seems that our police, and I mean the SA Police Service, as well as the various metro police and so on, tend at the drop of a hat to want to be shooting rubber bullets and tear gas and so on. We can understand, I think, very easily the situation in the US, where predominantly Black people and Black men especially are dying on a regular basis at the hands of police forces there. We can understand that in terms of white supremacy and generalized racist attitudes, etc. I think that's pretty clear. But it seems to be a little bit more complex here. I heard what you said about our police having sort of grown up and been taught still the attitudes of the old apartheid and even the colonial police forces and that style of policing. But I wonder if that's a sufficient reason. And I wonder also about many other African countries, many of which have been independent now for 60 years or more, where we again are aware of this very heavy-handed, disrespectful manner of law enforcement. So my question, I guess, is to what extent can we attribute the deaths of people like Collins Kosa and Petrus Michels and others here simply to the history of our police force? And to what extent is it more a question of bad training in the present, a poor understanding of their constitutional role and mandate in the present?
No, you're raising a critical question, because it's a question that we need to be answering without being ahistorical. We have to contend with the fact that we have a long history of colonialism, including which impacted those countries that you're referring to on the continent, which got their independence in the 60s, yet that heavy-handedness is still there. So a long history of colonialism, neo-colonialism here in South Africa in the form of apartheid, but then also a sense of where we were taught to almost hate self. And the process of unlearning needs to start with what Mr. Stephen Biko said, that we need to begin to appreciate ourselves by freeing our minds. Mm-hmm. And that process of freeing the mind has not happened. And I think until such time that we free our minds enough to be able to see what we have become, people that we are also becoming in future, in terms of those who are still to be born, that we reckon with the rebuilding of the soul of the African person, so that they then realize that what I have thought was normal was actually celebrating the abnormal. And at the moment, we have to then start with the curriculum that's taught in schools, where you still have Black children, for example, wanting to be white. Mm. What do you want to be? I want to be white. Mm. Because they can see that being white, there are some things you get which you don't necessarily get when you're Black. We then also free the police in terms of the current systems of training, that they know that it is not right to do what they did to Andries Tatane, for example. Yeah. But that the justice system also follows through when something like that has happened, to ensure that those who have done something wrong know that they did something wrong, and they are then wrapped on the neck of. For as long as it takes so long for justice to be realized, predominantly by Black people, you are likely to have these problems. You know, Mike, as you might know, that I've been driving around the country with Each One Feed One, a project that we are doing with the Kolisi Foundation, with Sia Kolisi and his wife, Rachel, and Imbumba Foundation with Richard Mabaso. And as we drive through the country, I see how inconsistency that applies, is something that I've expressed myself on. But then a peculiar situation happened when we were stopped in the Free State. And we must have been stopped for anything between 30 minutes to 45 minutes. Long queue, and we are being told, first queue, you must show your license, and the officer there looks at it, registers you as having passed there, what's your cell number, etc. Second table, check your temperature, and if you need further attention, you go to the third table. Throughout that, there's this white woman who goes on about how unfair this is, about how you actually, I've just heard another one not so long ago, about an hour ago. And deep down, I was watching this thinking, if it was me, these soldiers would have done something. If it was me, these soldiers would have told me something instead of appeasing me, instead of explaining and over-explaining. That's a graphic representation of why Black children would want to be white. And I think if we are to contend with this kind of system that the complexity of the system, it's not enough to have a democratic Black government in place. A non-racial government, one that believes that there should be non-racialism, that believes that we should always not be speaking in terms of Black or white, but we should be speaking of South Africans, one race being the human race. But then practically, you find that Andre Satane can die, and his life doesn't matter. You will find that the SANDF will justify why they had to kill Collins Khoza. They will justify, even with the most ridiculous of explanations they'll give, and they will then defend such a case in court until these families are exhausted.
Yeah.
It is in the same context that you can also have Michael Komape die in a pit latrine. And when he dies, the state then goes to every extent defending itself why it shouldn't do good by the family. It's in the same vein that Lumka died. Lumka Mkhetho died. The pit latrine, and to date, we're still trying to address that. Why should that be the case today, I ask Mike? Is it possible that we have to contend with the fact that in most instances, we do not think that Black lives matter enough, that we must deliver these services urgently without stealing from the poor?
Thank you, Sello. Any concluding remarks that you'd like to leave us with?
Well, thank you again, Mike, for this opportunity. I think it's important when we're dealing with these difficult issues that we also give hope to those who look at these and listen to these interviews and they think to themselves, when will Black lives matter? And to say that one day we will have a state which Nelson Mandela dreamt of, that Robert Sobukwe dreamt of when in a book, How Can Men Die Better? The author indicates that a man will forgive you for everything, even taking his wife away, stealing his money from him. But no man can forgive or forget a humiliation. We must remember that poverty humiliates daily. We must remember that those who are dealing with this daily, they feel the pinch of how they are being failed. And I'm hoping that we will then do what Madiba did while he was sitting in prison, writing to his two daughters from prison, writing a letter in 1969, and in which he says, I paraphrase part of it, that I miss you dearly. I know you miss me and you want to know when I will come back. I do not know, my darlings, when I will return. You remember that in a letter I wrote to you in 1966? I indicated that a white judge had said I should die in prison. I do not believe him. I believe that I will die in happiness with you. one day. But he then concludes by saying, don't worry about me now. I'm happy. I'm well, full of strength and hope. I hope we carry that kind of message through, and that we then become activists of hope, activists who live up to being ancestors like Mamuni of activism, who will not watch while others are being oppressed, repressed, killed, and we just fold our arms. That we then say, not in our name will this happen. That we will go out to the streets and say, whatever it takes, we will defend those who have nothing to defend themselves. So I'm hoping that we will build that country that Madiba dreamed of, that it's in your hands to help build a country that cares about the poor and the vulnerable. I thank you.
Thank you, Sello. That's a very positive note on which to end. Sello Hatang, the Chief Executive of the Nelson Mandela Foundation.